This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
there are always these arguments within socialist parties, both in Europe and the United States, about should we emphasize what they would call our immediate demands, or should we just emphasize, socialism as the cure?
Today we talk about the development of socialism both in Europe and the United States. Our guest is Gary Dorrien. He is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He is the author of the book, Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. Thousands of gun rights activists rallied at the Virginia Capitol under a heavy police presence. They were protesting plans by the state's Democratic leadership to pass gun safety legislation. The size of the rally and the expected participation of white supremacists and fringe militia groups raised fears the state could see a repeat of the deadly violence that exploded in 2017 in Charlottesville when neo-Nazis and white supremacists rallied. But today's rally concluded with no clashes or casualties. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam had issued an emergency declaration banning weapons on the Capitol grounds. Thousands more, mainly white male protesters, stood outside on nearby streets where the governor's order did not apply. Many were heavily armed. President Trump tweeted his support for the gun rights protest in the wake of the violenceville in Charlottesville 3 years ago when racial justice activist Heather Heyer died. He had said there were fine people on both sides. Early this morning, Heyer's mother told CNN she had a message for hate groups who might come to Virginia's Capitol.
I'm saying stay away. Don't go to Richmond. We don't need your help. We can handle this on our own. If I'm talking to someone who has come because they care to participate in violence, even though they're not normally a violent person, again, stay away. If you're there to actually speak with representatives, have your voice heard, have calm conversations about what's happening, by all means, be there. But understand that it may be dangerous today because there are foolish people who choose to go and stir up more hate.
Susan Bro, Heather Heyer's mother. President Trump's legal team asserted today he did absolutely nothing wrong. The legal brief calls the House impeachment case against him flimsy and a dangerous perversion of the Constitution. The documents, 2 articles of impeachment brought against the president, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, don't amount to impeachment offenses. It's meant as a counter to a filing 2 days ago from the House that summarized weeks of testimony from more than a dozen witnesses laying out the case for Trump's impeachment and removal from office. Before the filing, House prosecutors arrived on Capitol Hill to tour the Senate chamber. North Carolina Republican Senator Tom Tillis said Republicans are weighing an accelerated schedule. He said they might require each side to complete their allotted 24 hours of opening arguments in 2 12-hour days. Appearing on Fox, Trump confidant Senator Lindsey Graham said the president wants the trial over before he delivers his State of the Union address in 2 weeks on February 4th.
His mood is to go to the State of the Union with this behind him and talk about what he wants to do for the next rest of 2020 and what he wants to do for the next 4 years. He is very much comfortable with the idea this is going to turn out well for him. He believes politically this has helped him.
Democrats are pushing for witnesses and documents that weren't part of the House proceedings. Democratic presidential contenders celebrated the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday and King's legacy with parishioners at Zion Baptist Church in Columbia, South Carolina. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren engaged in the handshake that didn't happen in the frosty, immediate aftermath of the last debate. Presidential contender Tulsi Gabbard said, "This is the handshake," as Sanders and Warren reached across her to shake hands in the front row of Zion Baptist Church. The co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Washington Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, has endorsed presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. She'll rally with him in Des Moines, Iowa later today. Jayapal is the lead sponsor of the House version of Medicare for All legislation that Sanders has long championed. A big victory for the homeless Oakland mothers who organized as Moms for Housing. They announced they've reached agreement with the Los Angeles-based investment firm which evicted them from a vacant Oakland house they took over and lived in for nearly 2 months. Heavily armed Alameda County sheriffs evicted the mother and arrested 2 of them along with 2 supporters last Tuesday. Today, the Moms Group announced that Wedgwood Properties has agreed to negotiate the sale of what they called Mom's House through the Oakland Community Land Trust. That's a demand Wedgwood previously rejected. Carol Fife, director of the Oakland community group ACE, which supported the Moms for Housing, said Wedgwood now is promising to work with the city of Oakland and the Oakland Community Land Trust to negotiate a first right of refusal program for all the Oakland properties they own. Iraqi security forces fired tear gas and live rounds during clashes with anti-government protesters overnight and this morning in Baghdad. Officials said 2 people were killed and dozens wounded. Protesters were arrested. The United Nations envoy to Iraq urged Iraqi political elites to respond to the demands for sweeping political reforms and for protests to remain peaceful. I'm Eileen Alfandary. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I'm very happy to welcome back to our radio program Gary Dorrien. Gary Dorrien joined us about a year ago to talk about the intellectual underpinnings of Martin Luther King Jr. in a book called Breaking White Supremacy. Well, he's now out with a new book about the history of democratic socialism in Europe. Gary Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He is the author of the book that we will be in conversation about called Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism. Gary Dorrien, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Thanks very much, Mitch. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you, and we're going to dive into the history of European social democracy. But before we do that, let me ask you about somebody you actually begin this book about, and it's an American, a presidential candidate back in 1932. By then, and I think a lot of people don't, when we think of that time, we think of FDR, and I don't think a lot of people have heard of Norman Thomas. Who was Norman Thomas?
Well, Norman Thomas was the several-time presidential candidate of the Socialist Party. He grew up in Ohio, went to Princeton, then went to Union Theological Seminary in the early 20th century, heard about the social gospel, became a social gospel minister himself, was against World War I, was disappointed that the churches did not oppose the war once the United States went into it, and he notices that, well, these socialists, they're hanging in there. They're brave enough to still oppose the war and willing to pay the price. And so that took him from, although he's still in the Presbyterian pulpit, he joined the Socialist Party and then ended up scaling its ranks and ended up becoming their presidential candidate. So Norman Thomas was the face and the voice of the Socialist Party in this country for decades. In fact, there was even such a thing when people would want to identify what is democratic socialism, what sort of marks it out or signifies it. The name for that was, for a long time in this country, was called Norman Thomas socialism. It's like, oh, that kind of socialism, not some other kind.
So back in the day, Pete, you could say Norman Thomas socialism and people knew what you were talking about?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yes. That was the point of those campaigns, is that what else is the Socialist Party as a national entity going to do? They're going to make the case. He knows he can't win, but he is going to sort of make the case for a social democracy. And in fact, it's tremendously significant. His 1932 campaign certainly was, because Franklin Roosevelt did not run on any part of the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt Roosevelt ran on a balanced budget, and the slogan for the Democrats that year was "Hee-haw, we're coming back." Right? We're not Hoovers, though. We're gonna get back in, and they've got no more thought than that. What is at least not as promised on the campaign about what they're going to do if they get in. And 6 months after Roosevelt has taken power, he's instituted about 90% of the socialist platform of 1932 that Norman Thomas ran on.
90%?
Oh, sure. Virtually everything that is the New Deal, social insurance and the right of unions and collective bargaining and virtually everything that's there, what became Social Security and the like, go right down the row, including a couple things that were later declared to be unconstitutional. They all came out of the socialist platform. Now, the difference was that the big thing remaining yet was the socialists were for nationalizing the banks. And to Roosevelt, of course, that was a step too far. He wasn't going to do that. He had a bank holiday, but he wasn't going to take them over. And so Norman Thomas said for the rest of his life, when people would say, well, you should feel good. FDR carried out your platform. Thomas would always say, yeah, he carried it out on a stretcher. That he did feel that the very group that screwed things up the most didn't pay for it. And there was some, not just misgiving, but a mistake that occurred there. The Socialist Party did get the next part of this story wrong. If had they been a kind of effective ballast to Roosevelt in the mid-1930s, kind of working with him, taking credit for what, he stole from them, pulling him to the left, but being in the New Deal coalition, the way even the Communist Party was, because, even communists figured this out. They got to get with the New Deal, and yet the socialists held out against it, kind of held their nose and said, "No, that's not what we meant," and it hurt them. It was one of the two or three most devastating things they ever did, negatively, and it contributed mightily to how in a later time people don't remember Norman Thomas.
That's very interesting because you're right. I was not familiar with his name until I read it in the opening, in the preface, really, of your book on democratic socialism in Europe and the development of that, especially in the 19th century, which we're going to dive into. When I think of a perennial presidential candidate who gets under 1%, even though I think at one time he got a little more than that, I think of someone like Eugene Victor Debs or Ralph Nader. I never thought of Norman Thomas.
Well, Eugene Debs was Thomas's predecessor. Debs founded the Socialist Party in 1901, and then he ran for president 5 times. So he was their perennial candidate, and he's a more radical figure in some ways. Debs grew up in the trade union movement itself. He got radicalized in the union movement. He's much closer to being a Marxist, although he wasn't a Marxist, but he's closer to it than Thomas, because Debs did have this idea that socialism would just solve all our problems. That's a kind of magical way of thinking about socialism that is basically prescribed in Marxism, and then there are other versions of socialism where people believe that. And so Debs wasn't good on certain things that we think are terribly important today. Not to say that he didn't have good positions, but he always thinks, the answer to racism and the answer to the crisis of women not being able to vote and just everything else that matters is socialism, right? That's always what he says, and there's something bracing and strong, powerful, brave about his witness. So he's this sort of legendary figure who got almost 6% of the vote in 1912. Thomas is a much more genteel figure. He went to Princeton, was a seminary graduate, was a Presbyterian minister for many years, so he's more genteel, and he also just even reflects how the Socialist Party changed in the 1920s. It's much less a party of working people, of people in unions, of the socialist wing of the AFL and so on, and much more becoming a middle-class thing where there are, Norman Thomas clubs on campuses all over the country. So socialism in Thomas's time, that is in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, becomes much more sort of the province of social democratic intellectuals, and doesn't have nearly as much purchase within the unions themselves, which is partly a function of the fact that they held out against the New Deal back when it mattered.
Well, let's let this be the segue into how we get into European socialism. And
Sure.
let me ask you this, because it was my understanding before, but I'm not a scholar on this, that the socialism that we would recognize, universal health care, the things you get in Europe today, was actually something that was inspired by the New Deal and how the United States dealt with the Great Depression, which of course included Keynes, who wasn't necessarily a socialist, but
No, he was a liberal.
yeah. So is that accurate, or and who then influenced socialism in the United States in the 1930s, or someone like Norman Thomas? Where did his influences come from? Was that from Europe?
Well, indeed. I mean, there is there are always these arguments within socialist parties, both in Europe and the United States, about should we emphasize what they would call our immediate demands, or should we just emphasize, socialism as the cure? They always have this debate, and the ones that are more Marxist have it especially harshly. I mean, it's very pressing for them because the people who are always saying no, we need to emphasize our immediate demands, women's suffrage, and getting rid of Jim Crow and whatever, all of the sort of reform causes that are immediate demands. If you add all that up, I mean, that's just always what most people think of as democratic socialism, right? It's all those. It's the collection of all those reform causes where basically you're saying we can never really have equality of opportunity without some measure of equality of condition. If you don't have some measure of equality of condition, you just sort of flunk the prerequisite of what it actually means to have equality of opportunity. You don't have equality of opportunity as long as your zip code is a very good predictor of your life chances. So socialists are always the ones sort of pressing on those kind of issues about what in Europe is called solidarity wage policy, or before that, just even the progressive income tax, and income tax itself. I mean, all of these social policies that are trying to break down concentrations of power, to be in pursuit of equality and more freedom for all, movements that are simply emphasizing that that democracy itself is always the test, the challenge to any kind of privilege. That's that in this country and in Europe, but especially in Europe, it's the socialists who raised these issues. The U.S. is there's something peculiar about the U.S. version of all this, because there was this sort of tradition of radical democracy, of radical Democrats and the Tom Paine and people like that, traditions for a long time, before it's called socialism here. Americans don't really start talking about socialism until the 1850s. And that's when you've got Germans fleeing autocracy in Germany because after the 1848 revolution, they got it pretty bad. And so a lot of them had to just flee. And so a lot of the founders, the Republican Party in this country, are German exiles who, fled Germany, and they're socialists. I mean, they were in socialist movements in Germany, and they still were when they got here. And they founded the first socialist party, the Socialist Labor Party, and then later they were very strong within what became the Socialist Party as well in 1901.
Yes, the beginnings of the Republican Party was very different than the Republican Party we would know today.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's the last time that a third way movement got all the way, that a third party made it, and it's because they're abolitionists.
Yeah.
I mean, a different kind of abolitionists, to be sure. Some of them are merely anti-slavery types who don't want, slavery to expand any further. But
it was diverse. But you had radical Republicans,
within.
Indicating.
But they're all accused of being moralistic, that, wow, you think slavery matters this much? And, they all said, yes, it does, right? This is life or death for our republic itself. And even though Abraham Lincoln was, hardly a paragon of righteousness from an abolitionist standpoint, he's anti-slavery enough to be in the Republican Party and to help it succeed.
Where does and when do we see the rise of what we would recognize as being European socialism?
Well, in European context, this is a story. It starts really in the 1820s. I mean, you can trace. Every time you pin a date, and you say, yeah, but how'd they get that way? So of course there are currents between the French Revolution and 1820. But the paradigmatic figures were just at the beginning of all of it, where every kind of socialism you could talk about has got some kind of underpinnings in something that goes back to something. It's in England, it's Robert Owen in the 1820s, and in France, it's Fourier, same time in the 1820s. And both of them, Fourier and Owen, have this idea of a cooperative society, of a society that instead of forcing workers to compete against each other in a marketplace that's predatory and competitive, that we could design enterprises and economies that are more cooperative, where we actually reward cooperation, and such that instead of competing with each other, we can work for each other and with each other to build cooperative societies that are actually closer to our moral values of what we like, what we care about. That is cooperation and being peaceable and working together and caring for each other in a common good. So both of these figures, Fourier in France and Robert Owen in Britain, are the founders of cooperative traditions. I mean, long traditions of both consumer and producer cooperatives in both places. And socialism itself, I mean, since that's what they called it, that's what socialism is. It's the idea that those great promises of the French Revolution that never reached the working class.
Tell me more about that.
Could be refilled by developing a cooperative, economy.
Tell me more about the aftermath of the French Revolution and how that relates to the development of socialism in the next century.
Yeah, well, the French Revolution was radical in its own way. Liberty and equality and fraternity. These sort of great, sort of noble slogans that that mobilized this incredible movement. And in cultural terms, it's quite radical because, the French Revolution wasn't just radical about overthrowing the monarchy. I mean, they wanted to overthrow the universities too, and the churches, and of course they did there. So there's an anti-clericalism that comes in France. That's a byproduct of the fact that the French Revolution was in fact culturally radical, the way that it was, and this has implications for the fact that Christian socialism in France, although there is a tradition of it, it was never remotely close to what it was in England, or even certainly in Switzerland, even to some degree in Germany. Because of the sort of the hostility against a church that's so definitely on the side of the nobility, the landlords, and the powers that be. But for all of its vaunted radicalism, the French Revolution never cut to the working people, right? It doesn't have anything for them, and so you don't have the earliest currents of what becomes unionism, trade unionism in France, are persecuted in France there. So the early movements for socialism in France are people who, tell this story. This is not something that has to be debated. This is the story of their lives, knowing that the French Revolution just never even reached. It didn't even try to do anything for people, way down, the vast majority who have very little and who are creating the wealth that other people live off of.
It's commonly described as a bourgeois revolution.
That's right. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Of course, that term itself, we only have that term because that's Marx. That's Marx. Marx sort of
Marx
puts a certain connotation, but defines the sort of middle class in a way that confers a certain kind of odium on it. And this term, very term bourgeois or bourgeoisie, doesn't have the same purchase in England and just never really caught there the way it did in continental context, because of course England's got this backstory of liberalism, of liberal law, of a reform movement that did get somewhere. So the revolutions of 1848 that just were climactic and bloody and upheaval, virtually all over the continent, did not happen in England, because England by that great year of revolutionary year of 1848, it has already instituted just enough liberalism and a reform movement where people don't feel that they need to overthrow the whole thing. So culturally, for so far as religion goes, even sort of the future of the cooperative movement, this English story is quite different than the way it is in much of the rest of continental Europe. And it certainly does for, one of my 4 strands in this Social Democracy in the Making book is to always just, okay, where are the religious people, or how are they in this movement or not in it? And in England, they're just always just deeply in it. English or British socialism just is not something that's alien to Christianity or religion or religious communities more broadly. In fact, Christian socialism itself goes back to 1848 in England. It's this famous trio of F.D. Morris and Charles Kingsley and John Ludlow. And they're these are major figures in the whole Anglican tradition. So
was Robert Owen
you've got
religious?
An early tradition of Christian socialism.
You mentioned Robert Owen. Was he religious?
Well, he's got a religious wellspring of a sort. I mean, Owen himself was apprenticed out very early in life, so he's one of these people who, he's already working at the age of 8. Now, fortunately, he didn't have as bad as many of his peers. He's not, in some factory just slaving. But
quite the opposite. He. I mean, this is the interesting story about Robert Owen, isn't it? That he's actually a mill owner.
That's the thing. He has this background in mills that then he says he becomes this kind of self-made millionaire. He works his way up after being apprenticed, and is pretty good at it, and he's a smart guy, and he's an autodidact, so he reads a lot. So he's read about world religions, and he's read about economics and the like, and so he's the very exemplar of that late 18th century self-made capitalist, come right straight from poverty to wealth. So he's just made to order, you'd think, to kind of celebrate himself for being, this exception who shows how capitalism is the freedom movement and all of that. And yet, Robert Owen remembers what it was like to have to go to work when he was very young, and feels what's not right in the way that capitalism is developing. And so when he starts his mill, when he forms his enterprises, he treats his workers better than anybody else he knows, and even pays them when times are tough. So like when the War of 1812 went on, and it's really tough for enterprise in England, he kept paying his workers. That's just unheard of where he is, that he's treating them well. And now he says, well, it shouldn't be just me. We should have laws in which they all have to treat their workers well, because they're making the wealth for us. There's enough to go around. We can be get plenty of rich off of this and still share the wealth with the people who are, making it for us, and give them, decent working conditions and the like. That's what gets Owen started. And what radicalizes him is precisely the experience that his new friends, the rich capitalists that he knows in his social life, they're all against him. They don't want any kind of reform bill. They don't want any kind of legislation that gives workers rights, that gives them a certain share of a harvest or anything. They just want to keep them down and keep them working, and that's what radicalizes Owen. He says there's something predatory within the very nature, within capitalism itself, that it just it turns people who should otherwise be better than they are into these kind of selfish, predatory types who just want to, grind the faces of the poor and don't want to give anybody their due, and they think that they think that it's all theirs, that they deserve all of it. That's the radicalizing thing for Robert Owen, and it sends him in the direction of becoming, England's first socialist.
That's when
it's basically a version of a cooperative society.
And that's when the term socialism appears in English. Yeah.
Yes.
In 1827, you write.
Yes.
You also write that he then would try to set up other socialist, communities based on mills, including in Indiana, here in the United States, in Indiana. They all failed,
Germany.
though. And Germany, but they all failed.
They all did. Well, he doesn't. What he doesn't get about this is that you can inventing a little mini civilization from scratch with all new values, and that hasn't really thought through the religion problem, and that hasn't just even recognized that people come from places that you can't. He is an 18th century rationalist, and in thinking that if you could just design an ideal society, and then populate it with human beings who are willing to work toward your ideal ends, that surely you can get them to work together in order to create something that's better than what the rest of the world is. And so he's just not taking seriously nearly enough that people come from places and have prejudices and limitations, and religion is a factor for them, and they're not willing to leave that stuff at the door when they join your community. So they battled over religion and battled over ethnicity and who's in play here, whose ideal, whose blueprint of the ideal society is the one we should be going with here, and all of that. And he lost most of his fortune trying to create these ideal communes, none of which made it. He also founded the first national union movement. This is in between a couple of his failures, to create a commune. Robert Owen was the first great unionist in England, and it was really getting somewhere to a point. But there was some of the folks who came into it are early versions of what we later call syndicalists. People who say that, basically they're anarchists who don't believe we should have a government. They just think the unions themselves should be the next government. And that movement clashed with the group that Owen tried to start. And it was such a disaster that then for decades afterward, that's in the cultural memory of England, that's what unionism is. Oh, it's that thing that Owen did. That was a disaster. And so you have this peculiar thing in England that socialism develops in England that's quite deeply religious. It's, religious people are very much in it. So they are there and important, and yet unionism is not that big a thing in English socialism, and neither is Marxism. Both unionism and Marxism are very latecomers to this whole British socialist 19th century history.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Gary Dorrien, Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. We are in conversation about his book, Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism. Gary Dorrien, I'm at the moment in our interview where I realized, we could go for 5 hours to tell this story, but we don't have 5 hours. So now I need to figure out how do we get this story that you're telling about the history of socialism and the development of it in Europe in the 1800s. And you talk about England. We're going to talk about Germany in a moment and that co-development. I think we already touched upon the aftermath and what was going on in France. But you mentioned earlier you're always following how religion plays a role in this. So let me jump into that with you now. How did Christianity in particular in Europe play a role in the development of socialism?
Well, in places where you have a workers' party, or something like that, that's not a flat-out Marxist or social democratic, continental style party, you'll find much more religious involvement, where there just isn't that hostility to religious folks or the like, or mutual hostility that you will have in some other contexts. So in England, Christian socialism is almost as early as almost any other. I mean, Owen himself was not religious, but there are lots of these folks in the Owen communities and in the cooperative traditions from the 1820s onward are Christian socialists, and then they're called that from the 1840s onward. And you've got major sort of revered figures in the whole Anglican Church, such as F.D. Morris, who are the forerunners of this whole thing. And then there's a mighty revival of first Christian socialism and then other forms of socialism as well in the 1880s in England. So you have three major groups, organizations of Christian socialism just within the Anglican Church alone, the Church of England alone in England in the 1890s. Some of these are really powerful outfits. I mean, they're and then there are others, sort of trickles of Christian socialists involved in the Fabian Society and in the Workers' Party movement, which the Independent Workers' League party starts up in 1893, which later becomes the Labour Party in 1906. So in England, there's no point in this story where it's being said, oh, religious people don't belong in this, just go back to your church or something. They're just always there. And then the idea that even that this is the business of the church, that goes with the social gospel. I mean, the social gospel in this country, or Christian socialism, it was called there, is just always what defines it. Is just saying that that religion has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice.
Was there a split like you would find today within Christian society between, say, socialism and capitalism?
Well, there's always, in all of these churches that the social gospel came out of, both anywhere in Europe and in this country, there's always an argument about this within religious communities. I mean, there are always people who are going to resist it and just say, no, that's not our business, the Bible isn't about that, or whatever. The church didn't say that in the 18th century, or whatever. So there's always a dispute about whether this is actually the business of the church to be involved in reform movements or socialist parties or the like. So there's always a battle about that. And as you remember of our conversation last time, Dr. King still had that battle with his own church. I mean, he's in the National Baptist Convention, and Martin Luther King, think of what a great sort of symbol he is of Christian socialism, and yet, his own denomination was against him all the way. He ended up having to go, into a different church in the early 1960s, create a new one. So that battle about whether or not this is actually the business of religious communities to be involved in this, gets too political, reform movement kind of work. That's always an issue. But what is the current, I would say the best of these social gospel movements, what you always sort of find within them is this sort of memory and this argument that, well, we only got on a better track when we all became abolitionists, or at least said you had to, or when we realized we've got to be against empire. That these are great sort of moral issues that are, if we don't get on the right side of these things, then our faith is corrupt and corrupting, and it's indefensible. Now, that's a social gospel argument, right? And that's the argument that sort of wins the day in these social gospel or Christian socialist communities. But they've always got an argument with, church bodies who don't want to go here.
And it's not like we already don't have enough divisions within socialism itself.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of that, and let's talk about Germany now and the important, and it's interesting because we're talking about the history of socialism in England. We're predating the time really that Karl Marx comes on to the scene. He's probably just still a teenager when we start hearing about socialism in England. So that's important to know. It doesn't begin with Karl Marx, but I guess for socialism and socialist movements in Germany, Karl Marx is a key figure, maybe the figure.
Certainly in the German story he is. Although there was a party that preceded Marx, and Marx has some familiarity with the figure who founded, the German socialism, which is Ferdinand Lassalle. Of course, Marx was in exile. He wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and that just meant he can't go home to Germany. And so he...
And he would spend most of his time at first in Paris, but then in England and London.
So where does he spend most of his life? Yes, the one country that's liberal enough to put up with him. Right? They know very well who he is.
But did he have any sway in English socialism?
Well, Marx had only become this sort of radical socialist type a couple of months before he wrote the manifesto. I mean, there is this group called the League of the Just that he and Engels get in with, and in fact, they only joined the League of the Just in December of 1847, and they get the assignment right now to write something for us, put something out there, say what we're about, and so then they write this thing, the Communist Manifesto, that announces in its first sentence, that there's a specter haunting Europe, right? It's the specter of socialism, which is ridiculous, right? That is not the specter haunting Europe in 1848. What's haunting is democracy, the liberal democracy. It's the bourgeoisie claiming its rights. Well, Marx called them the bourgeoisie. That's the specter that's terrifying the landowners and the aristocracy. That the revolution of the middle class is really getting somewhere, and these people want to vote, and they think they have rights, and they think they know better than the people running the universities and this is a
similar dynamic we saw with the French Revolution, which maybe is a very similar theme, maybe not in every revolution, but many. It is actually sort of the upper middle class,
right, that
seek the revolutions because they're wealthy, they're well off, but
right,
they're shut out of power.
Right.
Yeah.
So Marx is, the whole idea here is to speak to and for this great mass that's always submerged, that has no voice, that in fact is by far the many, and yet they're never in play. It's never, to Marx, the bourgeois revolution isn't the real one. He's willing to make use of it, right? So this is the paradox that's built into the Communist Manifesto right from the beginning, and that's in a lot of 19th century socialism, this paradox that he's saying that actually this middle-class democracy argument is not the real revolution. It is a revolution, but it's not the real one, right? It's just kind of a way station to the one that really matters. Because these middle-class people, they just care about themselves. And what we need is the one that will be for everyone. And that's the proletariat. And so he doesn't have any trust that these middle-class people could actually be allies to what he calls proletarians, the great explosion from below. And yet he does have this idea that you can make tactical alliances with these different sort of middle-class movements. So there's a kind of double-mindedness that's right in the manifesto itself, where he's announcing the funeral of the bourgeoisie, that what he calls the bourgeoisie, at the very time that he's saying, but we got to make tactical alliances with it in Germany and England and France, and wherever it exists, in order to help it, achieve its revolution, and then we'll overthrow that one. And that very kind of double-mindedness, is then ongoing in continental social democracy, because all these social democratic parties that, once they're parties, now they're going to run for office. Well, what are you going to run on? It's usually you're going to run on your immediate demands and what you can do in government right now. That is to say, you are, just by virtue of being a party and running for office and getting people elected, it's going to mean there are reforms. There are immediate something that you're going to try to get. And now you're hooked into just what politicians do, compromising and all of that. That very problematic is actually built into, it's in the manifesto itself, and it's in Marx's later work even more strongly, I would say. But yes, Marx makes his early mark from the manifesto, and then he spends most of the next 20 years just holed up in the British Museum in England.
In the reading room.
Reading and writing.
Yeah.
He can't go anywhere else, and he's not really part of anything else until the first great international is formed, and it was formed in London. So he did show up for it.
Well, the first international is important, and here's where you see the display of how people have very different ideas and how socialism will come to be.
Yeah.
What was the first international?
It's the collection of all that has happened, in the mid-19th century of working people in different figurations throughout Europe and England, to realize some version of a socialist idea. And some of them are more democratic than others. Some of them are more state-oriented than others. In some cases, you're hoping that the state could impose some form of socialism, or could at least maybe help finance producer cooperatives or the like. In other cases, you got people saying, no, that's the last thing you want, is the state to be running some kind of socialist anything. The state is the enemy. The state just shores up capitalism or the ruling class. The idea of socialism is to create a create a society where the workers can make determinations, and you aren't depending on the state for anything, because once the real revolution comes, we won't even need a state. So there's this whole kind of sprawling variety of different things being called socialism. They all have some connection. I mean, if you trace the threads, you can always trace it back to one iteration or another of sort of what it means to try to develop a society that has cooperative values, where instead of competing with each other, we're going to be trying to cooperate with each other. But that, of course, means different things to these different sort of 19th century movements. And there's Marx just sitting sort of in the back row when they finally create an organization so that these aren't just little local or even national movements, but there's an international body that's working together to sort of fulfill this dream that the next time they call us to war, we just won't go, because we'll owe a loyalty to each other that will be greater than the loyalty we owe to the nation state. And so we'll be able to put an end to war. And the early socialists, that's part of their dream. Now, Marx did become very influential in that first international. And then over the course of the 1860s and early 1870s, there develops a kind of pitched battle between the Marxist wing of the First International and the anarchist wing. And it might seem like it's a small difference, but it's an enormous one that actually just destroys the International.
And the other side was led by the anarchist side was led by Mikhail Bakunin. Yeah. And that would lead
the two great antagonists. Yeah. And it focuses right on this state issue, because Marxism is a kind of vision, a dream of a successful proletarian movement that once it succeeds, the state, as Marx puts it, will wither away. I mean, he really has this kind of purely sort of utopian idea of the revolution succeeding, and then just not, true human nature will kind of burst forth and will cooperate with each other and won't be oppressed by all these things that tear us, and we won't be racists anymore, and all of that. And Marx just has this very sort of utopian consciousness about what difference will come about once the many have their revolution. And Bakunin, the anarchist side, is not nearly so trusting in that. There, you've got a specific strategy, an animus, really, to smash the capitalist state per se. That if we don't smash the state per se, the state will end up co-opting, corrupting, taking over any revolution you may have. And Bakunin thinks he believes that he knows he's right because he doesn't trust any of these Germans to be good socialists. He thinks they're all statists. They're all obsessed with getting an empire. It took them so long to even get a country that all Germans are sort of infected with this nationalism that just means that they're not good socialists. And so not only does he not trust the Lassalleans who are in the First International, Bakunin doesn't trust the Marxists either. And the whole First International broke up over that conflict.
Was there debate done in person over writings?
Oh yeah, they met at congresses. Now you would get and so where they're it's back and forth between them, and it cut. You go from nation to nation. It's mostly a Marxist story in Germany, and more anarchist and coming from France than Marxist or the like. But then you get your National Party. Well, in all of them, there are mixtures, or there'll be some more than others, but there's still, even within national groups, you're fighting out this Marxist versus anarchist thing. Plus, of course, there are other varieties of socialism in play as well. The LaSalle movement and Marxism are not the same thing at all. That battle within Germany is a battle royale that goes on for years within Germany, and it was only really sort of settled when they founded the Social Democratic Party in 1875 and then worked it out.
Dorian Gray, you mentioned earlier that we had a situation where, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
I said it, and I'm like, wait a minute, why am I thinking of a painting here? Let me redo that part. 3, 2, 1. Gary Dorrien, you said earlier there was this pledge amongst at the First International, amongst all the socialists, that they together will oppose the next Great War.
Right.
Now, this is decades before we get to the World War I, but still, that was still the promise going into World War I.
That's right.
Is that all the socialists would oppose it, and this would be their chance to create a new world order.
That's right.
That didn't happen. In fact, not all, especially the United States, socialists still opposed World War I. But many socialists actually ended up supporting the war effort, and especially in Germany, where perhaps the most powerful socialist group, German Worker Party, did throw its hat into the war.
Yes, this is the great tragedy. And then so much else then comes from it that would then be what competes with this for the great tragedy. That is all that came from out of communism and all that. It's all flowing out of this just colossal tragedy of the moment in August 4, 1914, and right up to that day. Even 2 days before August 4. When party discipline prevailed and, the Social Democratic Party voted for the war credits and voted to support the war. Even 2 days before, they are still saying in these blistering manifestos that they are holding fast to the faith, that they're still socialists, which means they're internationalists, and they're not going to go to war to start slaughtering our brothers and sisters in some war that, we can't even decide what it's really about. They do feel squeezed, and most of those folks who were at that Social Democratic Party convention in 1914, they do fear the Russians. They fear this sort of Russian horde that could come in and lay waste to them, and so they do feel some pull there. They have anxiety about that, and that's even a factor that caused people like Edward Bernstein to vote for a war on August 4th, and then very soon after to say no. That was a colossal mistake.
And Edward Bernstein's a big deal. He's a big figure in European socialism. Who was he?
Yes. In the German context, he is the father of democratic socialism. He is the person who makes the argument within the German Social Democratic Party to say that democracy is not just a means to socialism, or it's not even what we get to at the end once we've had the socialist revolution. We have to be deeply, thoroughly democratic in means and in our end all the way, otherwise we're betraying democracy. Karl Marx thinks of democracy as just a form of government, and so therefore it's a quite low priority sort of concern to him.
He's not against democracy, but it's just not the highest.
I think in a deep way, Marx is a Democrat, right?
Yeah.
Marx does assume that socialism is deeply democratic. That is to say, it has democracy just its virtual DNA. It's the socialism is supposed to get you to democracy. But you do have this argument within different forms of 19th century socialism, especially in the late 19th century, as to whether democracy is the means toward which you obtain socialism through parliamentary, politics, or is it actually the objective you get once you have, in fact, overthrown the capitalist class, and now, the many can vote, and, now we'll have democracy. And that's, of course, there's an enormous amount at stake just between those two positions, which were rival positions in the Social Democratic Party all along for its entire history. The SPD had this debate. And Edward Bernstein was just the first great sort of theorist of what then was called democratic socialism. Because until Bernstein sort of makes this argument, the Marxists think of these democratic socialists as what they call opportunists, right? These are people who are they're opportunistically, hoping to get elected, and they emphasize these reform causes, and they say, "Oh, we're good liberal Democrats. Don't be afraid of us." It's that sort of thing. And Bernstein is the first person to write out a full-scale sort of theory of democratic socialism, at least in a German context, and to say, no, actually, Marxism doesn't quite get this right. And the reason that Bernstein becomes such an enormously influential figure is that he was the guy in the Social Democratic Party for a dozen years in running their newspaper in Switzerland and then later in England, because he can't go back to Germany. He's in exile. But he is one of the main defenders of Marxism, other than Karl Kautsky and Friedrich Engels himself. Edward Bernstein was about the most famous Marxist of the 1880s, and so he knows his Marxism as well as anybody on earth. And he uses that expertise and his immense personal moral authority to make the argument that no, the only worthy kind of Marxism has got to be democratic all the way. It can't just be the objective that you find in Leninism. That any kind of Marxist-Leninism, which of course is a later phenomenon, that's all being ruled out and refuted by Bernstein. But Bernstein can see how what becomes Leninism could come out of what was called orthodox Marxism. And if you don't get this democracy argument right at the outset, and just say it's all important, then you might just be led to some perversion of socialism where you're just some vanguard is claiming that it has the key to history and it knows how to manipulate the revolution, and now you're landed right straight in Leninism.
Gary Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, Professor of Religion at Columbia University, and author of the book that we have been in conversation about called Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism. Gary Dorrien, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you greatly.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Great to speak with you again.
That does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Our intern is Jean Froger. Kirsten Thomas is our engineer. You can hear archives of our previous shows online at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and thank you for listening.
800 men have been imprisoned, 800 at Guantanamo Naval Base for 10 years or more without ever being charged with a crime. They had nothing to do with 9/11. They never posed any threat to Americans, yet many of them are still locked away, buried alive in that criminal U.S. prison in Cuba. Peter J. Honigsberg, professor at USF School of Law, founder and director of the Witness to Guantanamo Project, has produced a book about this outrage, a place outside the law, Forgotten Voices from Guantanamo. Robert Scheer insists the book is doing God's work. KPFA presents Honigsberg in conversation with Steve Wasserman Tuesday evening, February 4th, beginning 7:30 at the Hillside Club, 2286 Cedar Street in Berkeley. This KPFA benefit has wheelchair access. Get tickets at brownpapertickets.com or East Bay Indie Bookstores.
KPFA, KPFB Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in Santa Cruz, and online at kpfa.org.